So turn with me, if you would, to Hebrews chapter 12. It's going to be on page 972 of your chair Bibles. And one of the reasons I wanted to look at Hebrews chapter 12 is because it comes right after Hebrews chapter 11. I don't know if you were aware of that. That's how numbers work. But Hebrews 11 is sometimes referred to as the Hall of Faith. And as I was thinking about leaving a legacy, as I was thinking about reaching the next generation, the author of Hebrews points out these great stories from the past of the Hebrew people, stories of people who had followed God, who had tried to live a life of faith that showed loving God and loving others. And so it's from that awesome legacy and reminding his readers of that the author of Hebrews writes this, starting in verse 1. He says, "Therefore, since we are surrounded by such a great crowd of witnesses to the life of faith, let us strip off every weight that slows us down, especially the sin that so easily trips us up. And let us run with endurance the race God has set before us." So the author of Hebrews is encouraging his readers here to live out the faith that's been modeled for them. He references the last chapter where he'd just gone through story after story of men and women of faith who had followed God despite what had happened in their lives, despite the difficult circumstances they found themselves in. And he says we're to live our life because we're surrounded, or they're to live their lives because they've been surrounded by that great cloud of witnesses. They had the examples set out before them. They had people they could follow who had been men and women of faith. And he said, let us strip aside every weight that slows us down, especially the sin that so easily trips us up, right? I don't know if you've ever done a lot of running. I'm not much of a runner, but when I do, I have a problem, which is I tend to trip myself up a lot. I'm not the most coordinated person. But it can be challenging to run with weights too. Like imagine trying to run with things that are just dragging you down, holding you back. And so we're called to put off the sins that stop us from living the life of faith that we're called to. And we're told how to do this in the next verse, verse 2. We do this by keeping our eyes on Jesus, the champion who initiates and protects our faith. Because of the joy awaiting him, he endured the cross, disregarding its shame. Now he's seated in the place of honor beside God's throne. Jesus not only suffered and died on our behalf, but he continues to be there to make our faith stronger. He offers us the ultimate example to follow. The great men and women of Hebrews chapter 11 were just a shadow of the greatness of Jesus, because Jesus lived a life that was fully in compliance with loving God and loving others. And so as we look to leave a legacy of faith, we shouldn't try to point to ourselves, but rather point to Jesus. Live our lives in submission to him so that others who follow us are really following him. The writer of Hebrews goes on to say this, think of all of the hostility he endured from sinful people. Then you won't become weary and give up. After all, you have not given your lives in your struggle against sin. Christ has given so much for us, and we can look to that example. We can take heart as we continue to grow in our faith, because we know that in the struggle we have, in the hard times, in the ups and the downs, God has a plan for us in it. And the author of Hebrews continues to talk about why it is that we sometimes deal with these things, what God can be doing in us through the challenges we face. Look at verse 5. And have you forgotten the encouraging words God spoke to you as his children? He said, my child, don't make light of the Lord's discipline, and don't give up when he corrects you. For the Lord disciplines those he loves, and he punishes each one he accepts as his child. I don't know about you, but when I read those words, it can be a little challenging. And I think the reason I find it a little challenging is because there's a word in there that is not one I'm a huge fan of. and it's not the one you think. It's actually the word discipline. I struggle sometimes to be disciplined. It's something I am working on, and I am trying to be a more disciplined person. And one of the things I have to do is accept the corrections that God sends my way. To accept what he's given me when he tries to change what I'm doing. Yielding to that. And that can be challenging, especially if you're stubborn. I'm a little stubborn. But the author of Hebrews is reminding his readers that parents who love their children set boundaries for them. They'll make guardrails to protect their kids, to help them become the type of people they need to grow up to be. And God, as a good father, does the same thing with us. The writer of Hebrews goes on to say in verse 7, as you endure this divine discipline, remember that God is treating you as his own children. Whoever heard of a child who is never disciplined by its father? The author of Hebrews is saying here that the discipline God gives us is not an attempt just to hurt us so that we feel hurt for hurt's sake, but it's a sign that we belong to him as his own beloved children, that he wants to set us on a good path. He wants to guide us towards him more so that we can show that love towards him and towards one another. God corrects us because he cares for us deeply. Look at verse 8. If God doesn't discipline you as he does all of his children, it means that you are illegitimate and not really his children at all. Since we respected our earthly fathers who disciplined us, shouldn't we submit even more to the discipline of the Father of our spirits and live forever? I know those of us who grow up without perfect parents, I'll give you a hint, that's all of us. We sometimes maybe found it hard to submit to their discipline. Or maybe some of you had parents who didn't even really try to discipline you, but God is a good father who is perfect. And his discipline leads us towards that better life, towards loving him more and loving others. And so love states that our actions need to have consequences sometimes. When Jesus gave the parable of the prodigal son, he told the story of this rebellious son who basically went to his dad and said, I'm good if you die today. I want my inheritance from you right away. And this father allowed his son to go off and live the life he wanted to live. And you know what happened? That son had to deal with the consequences of his actions. He ended up poor and destitute in a foreign land and eating out of the same feed trough that they had for pigs. But when this son came back home, the father accepted him with open arms and lovingly embraced him. When the son accepted the correction and returned home, the father ran out to greet him and forgive him. And in this story, it took experiencing the consequences of his actions to bring this rebellious son back to his father and to change him. And when Jesus was telling this story, the father in that story was supposed to represent God because that's the way he treats us. When we wander off, when we try to ignore his discipline, we still end up dealing with the consequences of our own actions. But when we return to him, when we submit to his correction, he doesn't just wait for us to come to him. He runs out and he embraces us and he showers us with his love. And while God is always loving towards us, I think sometimes we struggle because we're not as loving as we know we should be. Look at what the author of Hebrews says in verse 10. For our earthly fathers disciplined us for a few years, doing the best they knew how. Now, again, I just want to remind you, if you're feeling like you're not a perfect parent, a perfect mentor, a perfect person to be reaching the next generation, I just want to remind you, none of us are. We're all trying to do the best we know how. But look at verse 10, at the end of verse 10. But God's discipline is always good for us, that we might share in his holiness. As imperfect parents and mentors to the next generation, we have the opportunity to point the next generation back towards the God who is perfect, to point them towards Jesus who lived a perfect life, to point them towards him because he lived out what it meant to love God and love others. And while sometimes in our own lives when we're not perfect, we have to deal with the consequences of that, When we're doing that, we have the opportunity to show the next generation people who are willing to submit to what God has for us. Look at verse 11. No discipline is enjoyable when it's happening, it's painful. But afterwards, there will come a peaceful harvest of right living for those who are trained in this way. What a beautiful outcome to come out of the struggle, trained in the way, a bountiful harvest of peaceful living, of right living, trained in God's way. And with that change, that discipline only comes when we aim not to just change or correct our behavior, but when we truly want to align our heart more towards God's. When we recognize that we've got to love God first so that we can then love others. And that's where our actions flow out of our hearts. Because ultimately, Jesus wants to win our hearts. He wants to see our lives transformed as our hearts are overflowed with his love. He's not interested in us just following rules. He wants us to truly love him and love others. And when we understand this, it changes everything. It means we're not just trying to be good because we have to. But when we love Jesus, we want to live the way he teaches us. So how can we show the next generation that Jesus wants to win their hearts? How can we transfer this on? How can we pass it on? How can we let this be the legacy we leave? How can we help instill in them the discipline that comes from following Jesus? Well, it's not going to happen all at once, and there's no 100% surefire way to get the next generation to embrace faith. And there's no perfect program that causes young people to just accept Jesus right away. But it starts by doing what Jesus did and focusing on winning hearts and not arguments. And I want to acknowledge that this sounds easier than it is, and it looks different at different stages of a young person's life. But I think it starts really by knowing them, by having some idea of what it is a young person is looking for at different times. Having some idea of what questions they might be asking, having some idea of what they might be motivated by. And luckily, there's been some really great research into child development over the years. And when you look at some of it, it can really help you understand how to do this practically. So I want to take a few minutes and walk you through just 4 stages in the lives of kids and some ways that maybe you can react to them and help them so that you can be focusing on winning their hearts and not winning arguments with them as you're parenting and mentoring. So during the preschool years, before the kids are in elementary school, around age 0 to age 4 or 5, kids are motivated by safety. Think about being a baby and coming into the world and everything is new and different and a little strange, right? I have a niece, her name is Eliana. She is now 3 months old. She's the most adorable baby in the world. Sorry, she is. And I watch her whenever I get the chance to see her, and her eyes are just looking around everywhere. And she's looking at everything. And she's scared a little bit by sounds that she doesn't see coming. So I think if you've spent time with kids, you'll see they're motivated by safety. And so what you can do in this stage of their life is you can embrace their physical needs. You can help them see that they are safe and cherished and loved. Then as kids get a little bit older and they get into elementary school, elementary age kids are really motivated by things that are fun. I am too a little bit. I like things that are fun. I think we all do. But to help win their hearts, you can engage their interests. Find out as your kids or as kids you're mentoring get a little older, what is it that interests them? What are some things that they like? What are some things that they find to be fun? And help engage with them. I was talking to a parent just earlier last week, and they were saying that they're not a very crafty person, but their daughter is. And so they've learned to be a little bit more crafty and do some crafty things with her. And I thought that's such a great example of this, engaging with their interest, even if it's something maybe you don't find interesting. Then as kids get a little bit older and they get into middle school, middle schoolers are often motivated by acceptance, right? If you've spent time with middle schoolers, it's all about who do I fit in with? Who are my friends? Who likes me? Or who do I like? And oftentimes what you can do there is just affirm their journey. There are many middle schoolers who are just struggling because they are looking for acceptance. So if you can affirm their faith journey, if you can help them plug in to people who are going to love them and show them the love of Jesus, that's one of the most valuable things you can do for a middle schooler in that stage of life. And then kids get into high school and they really start to be motivated by freedom. And a lot of parents feel like their kids are starting to pull away from them as they get closer and closer to 18. There's more freedoms that kids are given. There's more things that they want to do outside of family. And that can be a hard time. It's a challenging time. But what you can do there is really mobilize their potential. I really believe that high schoolers are, and teenagers are a huge part of reaching their generation. And so as you work with high schoolers, I just really encourage you, help go back to what they're interested in and help use that, help them learn how to use that to reach their peers and their friends. Learn who they are, know who they are, and help them mobilize their potential.